Hello, and welcome to Your Art Sucks, a podcast that aims to destroy mediocrity in all forms of art. And this is episode 10, Creative Smack, Layne Staley and Ginger Baker. I want to start this episode, the final one in season 1, by saying this. I didn't want to do this episode. The main reason is that I'm not interested in promoting the use of any drug, especially to those who may be inclined to experiment in an effort to further their artistic career. Now, I want to be clear here, as to not come off as a hypocrite. Some people listening to this may already know this, but in my youth, I've done drugs. I experimented in substances that would have been deemed probably psychedelic in their effects, as well as the routine use of alcohol. And coming from a family with a history of abuse, it was very ignorant of me to do such things. Fortunately, I was with a group of friends who weren't interested in pushing the mind-expanding experiments into less recreational, more harder-hitting narcotics. In the late 90s, when I was using, access to these so-called harder drugs was readily available. I can't recall a party I attended that didn't have a buffet of chemicals well within arm's reach. But for whatever reason, we just didn't bother. We were more interested in roaming the night and causing problems than being holed up in somebody's basement deep in some opioid coma. But, given a slight change in circumstances, I'm not certain that I, too, wouldn't have counted myself among the people who thought they were above addiction. I was young and arrogant. While I didn't believe that I was immortal, as at that time in my life I had lost a couple friends, I certainly thought that I was in complete control of my life, and the idea that I would become a junkie was just unfathomable. But let's all be 100% honest right now. So perk up your ears and listen, because this is the absolute truth. There's no person on earth who ever believed that they would become an addict before they ever became one. Not a single person ever believed that their actions would lead to their losing everything in life and possibly even losing their life. The reality is it happens in the most insidious manner. It can be as simple as a single lapse of reason that can alter the course of your life forever. Evidence of this can be seen when we take a look at the horror that is the opioid epidemic in North America. Here we see thousands of stories of people killed by making a single mistake. And if we really want to be real about how dangerous this opioid epidemic is, I was just reading a newspaper article about a local police officer who had accidentally touched a bag that contained black market fentanyl, and he immediately went into cardiac arrest. I mean, this is no fucking joke. It's that deadly. A single touch did this to a 200-plus pound man who was in amazing health. Now, fortunately, this officer survived, but it was that close of a call. Each of us knows many artists who've died using heroin. Yeah, there's countless other drugs I could be calling out in this episode for causing the death of famous artists. We know deaths related to alcohol and cocaine, for instance. But it's heroin that holds this mystique for most artists, especially those in the music industry. Heroin's had a long and storied career. Far too many have fallen into the trap of believing that you've truly arrived as an artist when you add heroin into the mix. Now, here's a quote from author Jeet Therel's book, Narcopolis. It sums up the ease of addiction and its seductive nature. So one of his characters says this. So when Carl said, "Why do you take drugs?" Well, she told him what she thought. Told him the truth because the least such question deserved a real answer. She said, "Oh, who knows? There are so many good reasons and nobody mentions them. And the main thing nobody mentions is the comfort of it. How good it is to be a slave to something. The regularity and habit of addiction. The fact that it's an antidote to loneliness. And the way it becomes your family. Gives you mother love and protection and keeps you safe." Now, from my perspective, if hearing what I just read is not the most hellish truth of the drug, I don't know what is. I mean, to have a drug that you believe has like this nurturing aspect to it, it's just completely frightening to me, in spite of the obvious evidence to the contrary and warnings of the dangers of use for everyone to see. The number of those who continue to fall into the similar ease of the junkie life cycle is unending. I could easily rip off a list of artists who've succumbed to this drug in the past decade alone, but it would be far too lengthy and far too depressing to do so. So let's just take a pass on that. What I will do, though, is bring to light two stories of artists who went down this black path, but who had very different outcomes. I must repeat, though, that in no way is this show or the stories of these artists' lives meant to celebrate or condone drug use. These are stories of caution. These are stories that ring with the level of an air siren blasting out over a community that just warns you to stay out of this minefield. So please keep that in mind as we begin with Layne Staley. He was the front man to the rock group Alice in Chains. So the Seattle music scene in 1987 was only a couple years away from bursting onto the world music scene with a brand of music we now know as grunge. And it was in these days that a young guitarist, his name Jerry Cantrell, who would have a random encounter at a bar with a guy that would basically change both their lives. He noticed this guy with bright pink hair piled on the top of his head, a really broad smile, and he was standing in the company of several gorgeous women. So Jerry looked at this guy, and there was something about him that just immediately drew him in. And in very short time, Jerry allowed this homeless stranger who was named Layne Staley to take up residence in his house. Now Jerry wasn't living in some mansion or anything like that. His house was basically one step above an alley, but it was something they both shared. Now Layne and Jerry hit it off right away, and their friendship became solidified when Jerry heard Layne singing. Jerry says this is the first time he heard Layne belt out a song. He says, "I knew that voice was a guy that I wanted to be playing with. It sounded like it came out of a 350-pound biker rather than skinny little Layne. I considered his voice to be my voice." And as the main core of the newly named group Alice in Chains, Jerry and Layne would go on to create music that fueled multiple top 10 hits and album sales that went into the millions. Along with bands like Pearl Jam and Nirvana and Soundgarden, Alice in Chains was one of the driving forces behind the mammoth success of grunge in the 90s. Their talent was obvious, and they were able to actually continue to headline concerts after most of the other bands faded from the grunge scene. But with money and fame came the unending supply of every type of indulgence one could ever conceive. It was a time when the world was at Layne's feet, and he wasn't one to turn away from it. Pearl Jam band member Mike McCready said this. He said he was funny and lucid, and without a doubt he was not reluctant to be a star. Layne's drug use was evident right from the start. It was also evident to those in his life as well as the public. And, the band didn't shy away from having most of their lyrics talk about drug use. But Layne was far from the only one in the band to indulge. "We partied like demons," admits Sean Keeney. That's the Alice in Chains drummer. He continues to say this. He says, "It took a toll on us. From 1991 on, it was getting pretty ugly," he says. And he says the album Dirt is a shining example of how ugly it got. No one wanted to address it because no one wanted confrontation. See, that album Dirt, heavy references to heroin use in the lyrics of that album. And that's what Sean Kinney's saying. He's saying it's obvious. Like, they were putting it out there that they were into drugs, and it was like the elephant in the room. Nobody wanted to talk about it. During the early 90s, Staley enrolled in several rehab programs, but he failed to stay clean for long. At one point, the other band members flew to Los Angeles for weekly therapy sessions with Staley. Sean Kinney says this. He says, "We would have done anything he wanted us to do to help him out. Sadly," he says, "I felt like he wanted us just to leave him alone." Now, there was a bit of turn of events here in April 1994 when Kurt Cobain committed suicide. And that actually pushed Staley into this temporary sobriety. But within very little time, he was back into his addiction. Pearl Jam's band manager, his name's Kelly Curtis, he says this. He says, "Everyone around Layne tried over and over again to help him get clean. But," he says, "in the end, there was little anyone else could do." For 15 years, it went on like this. But for the addicted, the lifestyle is one that's all-consuming. Here's a quote from William Burroughs, who's basically a self-described junkie. He sums up the daily life of someone who is addicted, and this appears in his book, which is appropriately titled Junkie. He wrote this. He wrote, "Junk sickness is the reverse side of junk kick. The kick of junk is that you have to have it. Junkies run on junk time, and they have junk metabolism. They are subject to junk climate. They are warmed and chilled by junk. The kick of junk is living under junk conditions. You cannot escape from junk sickness any more than you can escape from junk kick after a shot." The biggest blow for Staley came in October 1996, when his longtime girlfriend, Demi Perot, died of bacterial endocarditis. That was as a result of her own drug use. Mark Lanegan, he's a member of the band The Screaming Trees. They were also pretty big in the grunge era, and he was one of Layne's best friends. He said this, he said Layne never recovered after Demry's death. He goes on to say that after that, I don't think he wanted to go on. So following her death, Staley moved into this penthouse condominium. It was in a secured building, and he shut himself off from the world. He rarely answered the door or the phone. His health began to immediately deteriorate to such an extent that most of his friends thought him near death. Abscesses from years of heroin abuse covered his arms, and he lost most of his teeth. A 1997 internet rumor that he had lost an arm to gangrene became urban legend. But Staley steadfastly refused to return to rehab. He argued that self-help groups like Narcotics Anonymous just weren't for him. There were so many rationalizations he had of why he couldn't get better. They just kept piling and piling up for anyone who tried speaking to Layne about getting sober. For several years, he rarely left his condo. He began to employ a mix of heroin and cocaine, and he even started using crack. So because he didn't want to leave his apartment, he ended up finding drugs through employing a series of dealers who would come to his apartment regularly, and they would bring him what he jokingly referred to as his medicine. Sean Keeney further states that it got to a point where Layne kept himself so locked up, both physically and emotionally, even if you could get into his building, he wasn't going to open the door. You'd phone and he wouldn't answer. You couldn't just kick in the door and grab him, though there were many times I thought about doing that. But if someone won't help themselves, what really can anyone else do? That's such a valid point. But I think we all know where this is headed. Layne was found 2 weeks after he died in that same penthouse, and that was in April of 2002. Sadly, he was 25 years old, but he looked like he was 60. Don't know if anybody's been able to see pictures or... There's no need. I mean, it's just horrific what this man deteriorated into. The accounts of what other musicians who did see him during this time say he looked like were just absolutely awful. So while there's no official cause of death, the numerous substances that he consumed were obviously the main culprits. And if the medical examiner is to be believed, it appears that Layne died on the same day as Nirvana's Kurt Cobain. That would have been on April 5th. Cobain was also a user of heroin and consumed a large quantity of it right before his suicide. The story of Layne is one that is beyond tragic. His demise was a slow 15-year suicide. And as with anyone who dies from drug use, with or without Layne's successes, there's an unending tension with all of those who try to help them become sober. There's this constant belief that maybe they could have done more. Maybe if they would have taken a different approach or taken more control of their addict's life, the addict may still be alive. But the sad truth is that no one can stop this slow ride to hell unless the user actually wants to get off and stay off on their own. While the dominance of heroin is one that appears to be all-consuming, there are many who've been able to escape its vice-like grip. They've been able to mount an almost Herculean effort to turn their life around and to become clean and stay clean. Now, despite what most of you think, the picture is not entirely black. Let's look at the life of someone who, at one point in the 60s, because of his drug use, he was voted the musician most likely to not survive the decade. And that's saying something considering the heavy drug hitters who dominated the scene at the time. But in this case, I'm talking about drummer Ginger Baker. So there's probably a whole group of you that don't know or never heard of Ginger Baker. And I understand that. In the 60s, he was kind of an undercurrent success. He was in a lot of close-knit groups and a lot of like the jazz circles at the time. They're not well known to people today, unless you're an aficionado in it. But Ginger Baker was extremely talented. When he started out, his talent was noticed right away. But he's a guy who really wasn't that interested in using his fame for any purposes. He actually was a bit of a vagabond. He liked to roam around the world, and he wasn't concerned about his legacy whatsoever. But his impact on the 60s and the 70s is really well documented. Funny enough, like other artists I've spoken about in this podcast, like Iggy Pop and Jack White, Ginger was also introduced to music at a really young age when he was sat in front of a drum set, just like Iggy and just like Jack. And Ginger's parents they couldn't deal with the amount of energy that this young boy had, so they sat him down at a drum set, and he was able to pick it up quite quickly. And luckily for him, he was taught by a very famous jazz drummer. This guy's name's Phil Seaman. He was one of the leading British jazz drummers in the post-war era, and he taught Ginger how to play. And it was jazz that brought early success into Ginger's life. With his first band, the Graham Bond Organization, that was also in the early 60s, Ginger helped create this fusion of rock and jazz that led to several successful albums. It was pretty influential to people at the time as well. And also during the early phase of his career, these stories started to emerge about Ginger that were not at all flattering. He was known as a very belligerent individual who became excessively worse with the introduction of alcohol. Ginger's history is littered with many instances of him physically assaulting his bandmates as well as anybody who really crossed his path. And in little time, his abuse of alcohol would lead to the overuse of other drugs that included heroin. And here's where we see the real appeal of this drug. It was in heavy use in the jazz community at the time, and Ginger had no objections about taking heroin. He held the belief that doing so would align him with the many musicians he admired. Now, in Ginger's time, and with seemingly no decline in the belief today, sadly, there's this myth that I mentioned earlier about a substance like heroin that gives the user this ability to become better and more focused at their craft. They believe that this drug exists that only has all the highs and none of the lows. That there's this drug that can be consumed and, very little consequences. Artists fall for this utter bullshit on a daily basis. But I can say that in the 60s, and to Ginger's point, you could argue that drug use right in the 60s was still pretty underground. Its availability was somewhat secretive, and the quantities that were doled out, they were trivial by today's standards. There was no real observance of cause and effect then. Today we readily see the impact of what these chemicals do to your body. Sure, there was junkies in the 60s, absolutely. But in the atmosphere that was going on at the time, the fate of somebody who overused drugs was largely ignored. Now, this would rapidly change as the 70s changed the culture of drugs from one where it was like a majority of hallucinogens to the dominance of much harder drugs like coke and heroin. It was no longer an underground scene, and using those kind of substances equated one with epic feats of creativity and granted you this level of coolness that didn't exist prior. And Ginger's path on heroin, as I mentioned, it began quite insidiously. It was actually this little pill they called a jack. It was 1/6 of a gram of heroin, but it was in this tiny white pill. Now, anyone who saw it must have felt it was somewhat innocuous. If you look at the time, you say, well, I do full tabs of LSD and, I'm okay. What could this one little pill do to me? As ignorant as that sounds, there was some ability to be ignorant in these decades, as the chances that a single dose of anything that would just kill you right on the spot were slim to none. Heroin wasn't like we see today, where it's mixed or it's absolutely pure, to the point that people that have used heroin for decades, they immediately die. So having that ignorance back then, it's not excusable, but it wasn't as dangerous as it is today. Now, even with the difference in quantity that Ginger ingested to that of Layne Staley, who would have been much higher, the impact on Ginger's life still followed the same predictable downturn of any substance abuser. The slow decline started with the rise and fall of his next and easily most recognized band of Cream. He created Cream with fellow musician and legendary guitarist Eric Clapton. But Cream only existed for a short time because of the tension and behavior of Ginger and his bandmates. They're well quoted as saying that if the band hadn't had hit records, which they had, they doubt anybody would have ever heard of them because the group would have quickly collapsed with Clapton's alcohol abuse and Baker's drug use. And here's an interesting point about Baker as well, just to show you the level of quality and talent that he had as a drummer. He was at one point the main drummer for the Rolling Stones. He didn't find that it fit for him, and the band, probably didn't really want somebody that aggressive on their team. But he does take credit for introducing Charlie Watts, who's the long-term drummer to the Rolling Stones, who's also extremely talented. He introduced Charlie Watts to the band. So, would the Stones be the same without Baker's involvement? Or I don't know. If Baker would have stayed in the band, who knows what would have become of them. But what is known is that Baker, to many musicians, he was a drummer without equal. Even Eric Clapton has been quoted as saying that Ginger is far more talented than great drummers like Led Zeppelin's John Bonham, who I believe is the absolute best drummer to ever played, and The Who's Keith Moon. Now, this is sad because both John Bonham and Keith Moon died early in their lives due to alcohol and prescription drugs, respectively. John Bonham choked on his own vomit, and there was a medical report that said he had 40 shots of alcohol in his system. And then Keith Moon was trying to clean up his life. He was trying to get off of alcohol, and he was given a drug, a prescribed drug from a doctor that he ended up abusing, and it actually killed him. But for Ginger, his talent and successes, while they are not on the level of Layne Staley, they still allowed him enough time and money to deepen his connection to the drug. As his fame grew, his use grew. But here's where their paths diverge. So Ginger, unlike Layne, he didn't recede away from society. He didn't use his money to separate himself from family, and which he had a lot. He had 4 wives, and, his wives, they didn't stick around long. And I think that was also, another aspect of his addiction and his abusive and explosive personality. But to Ginger's credit, he wasn't interested in holding himself away. He refused to find himself in this lockdown penthouse type of mentality. He didn't follow William Burroughs' description of junk time either. Now, maybe it was due to his underlying personality that he didn't like anybody imposing rules on him or anything, restricting him from doing what he wanted to do. He liked to battle, and he certainly loved punching a challenge right square in the face as he did with so many of his adversaries. He wanted that fight. Baker said this. He said, "Every time I went to Africa, I got off heroin." Now, Baker's well known for going to Africa. He actually created a recording studio there. He helped a lot of artists find themselves in this recording studio and go on to create albums, and some famous musicians have recorded there as well. So he spent a lot of time in Africa. But he says that when he went there, he got off heroin. He says, you have to get and stay clean for at least 2 years. And in those 2 years, it's the most difficult time. He goes on to say, you reach a point where you can say no, and then you say no again. And the 3rd time, things go off in your brain. And then you say, I wish I said yes. And then on the 4th time, you just say yes, and you're back on it again. Now, Baker, he fought and fought and fought, but failed 29 times to his reckoning. And it wasn't until 1981, when he moved to Italy, that he kicked off heroin for good. He says, when I got clear of it all, I moved into a little village in the middle of nowhere where nobody spoke English. I got into olive farming, and it was really rewarding, and it was extremely hard work, but it made me very happy. He says it was really good therapy. But when asked if perhaps it could have been easier to go to rehab, Baker says, no, no, no. He says there's only one person who can help an addict, and that's the addict himself. He says the whole rehab thing is just a bloody con to make money and take advantage. I don't know if I believe in that. I think rehab techniques have come extremely far. From the 80s to today, I really think that there's a lot of great programs out there. And fortunately, Baker did get clean without their involvement, but he fought a death match with an opponent who was much bigger than he was. He was able to find success where the vast majority have lost everything, including their lives. So as of this episode, Baker's still alive. He's clean and he's still playing drums in spite of the loss of some of his physical power, and that's to age and infirmity. But he says this, he says, with all my disabilities, it's a miracle that I can play at all. And I'm playing as well as I ever did. If I'm enjoying the music, that overrides everything. The pain goes away. But when I stop a gig, having played for an hour and a half, I'm thoroughly exhausted. So here we are. We've come to the end of an episode that I never wanted to do. We've heard about the lives of two talented artists who gained success and fame, but who ultimately lost it all to drugs. And sadly, I find no evidence that the use of heroin improved their talent to any degree. It's a truth that there are lyrics that Layne came up with that were disproportionately focused on heroin and the suffering he endured. But there's no way for anyone to conclude that drugs themselves made him that artist, made him that musician. You cannot become a drummer just because you take a pill. You cannot become a great singer and write hit music just because you injected a chemical in your arm. Put simply, you cannot become talented from any external source. All creativity comes from within. It is born from within and it is fed from within. When you add any external source to this pool of artistry, you only turn a pure source that nourishes a person into a poison that kills off the core. That is without question the complete truth of it. What is it about heroin that allows this myth to continue unchecked for decades upon decades? What is it about this drug that fools the most successful and creative people to fall into its grasp? Well, for the purpose of this podcast, I'm going to take an opportunity here to examine if there's any possible benefit that we can derive out of, the effects of heroin without actually using the drug. And I think I may have found one. It comes in the form of a term called cognitive disinhibition. Neurologist Dr. Alan Dagger, he draws a connection between exceptionally creative people and insanity. He says this, he says, there are many artists whose creativity is almost like madness, but not quite. In conditions like schizophrenia, you have thoughts that are jumbled together that don't necessarily belong together. You have lateral thinking, and thoughts go into bizarre directions, which might be helpful with coming up with bizarre ideas. He says part of creativity is being original, so drugs like cocaine and perhaps heroin have that ability to help you have original thoughts. Harvard psychology professor Shelley Carson agrees with Dr. Dagger and says further to the point, however, failure to screen out previously irrelevant stimuli might also hypothetically contribute to original thinking, particularly in combination with high IQ. So the basic idea is that for originality to occur, artists need to be able to find connections where no connections previously existed. There needs to be a way for an artist to sift through all the noise and tie together strings or concept or words that don't naturally align. For some, as Dr. Dagger says, this process has been hijacked through the use of external substances like heroin. Either knowingly or unknowingly, creative types may have used their bodies and brains as a petri dish to which chemicals and creativity were combined into some grain of original work. Let's be clear, though. No matter the chemistry, there must always be a latent creativity present for any of this to produce work of value. And this is the counterpoint to that. It's basically saying there has to be a couple factors. All right, so the couple factors are this. There has to be some level of IQ. And Professor Shelley Carson says that she tends to see this original thought in people with higher IQ. And with that, there has to be this latent creativity. The third barrier is the barrier that people have been hijacking through the use of drugs like heroin to make these irrelevant stimuli connect in some way that people find interesting and they find something in, but the average person would never connect these two pieces together. So, if we want to explore this cognitive disinhibition without using drugs or without the genetic disposition to mental affliction, how can we achieve originality? Well, I'm going to give you full credit here. I'm going to say, yes, you have the necessary genius and that you also have amazing talent. All right. I'm just going to call that right out there and say everybody listening is super smart and super talented. So we all agree on that. So what's lacking is some method to bridge that gap that these drugs would facilitate. So, what can we do that would allow us to alter our view of the world so that it becomes foreign and askew in a way that drugs would do to your brain? What would allow us to free ourselves from the commonplace connections that guide our everyday thoughts without our control? Well, I've done a little bit of research because I really want to help you here because I really want to find value in this episode. And I think I found something here. So there's other psychologists that have come on board with Dr. Dagger, and they've looked at his work, and they said that they see other examples of this in facets of life that are not drug related. They've seen real creative thinkers who've done things that have nothing to do with drugs but are coming with the same results. So there's a psychology professor, his name is Dean Simonton. He believes that disinhibition can occur with people who are exposed to a multitude of cultures. He feels that such an experience can detach common thoughts or practices of a single culture that most people are aligned with. And when they're exposed to another culture, it creates a clash of contrasts. And he says that an artist, when they're confronted with this clashing, these two cultures that don't necessarily align, he says it's up to the artist, who's kind of untethered in between both of these realities, to tie things together in a way that makes sense for both. It's like the artist is able to rationalize their presence amongst all of this noise. And that creates these bonds of commonality that people who are in a single culture could never put together. Simonton also believes that experiencing limitations of a physical nature, like a physical disability or facing the harsh reality of being a minority, would also induce thought patterns that would break what the majority of society believe in. And I find that really interesting. There are tens of millions of people that have disabilities, and they're facing a world that is entirely different from what the most people face on a daily basis. Or, think of all the things that are going on to this day that have to do with racism, which just blows my mind. Think of all the frustration that two people, because of race, can experience the world two distinctly different ways. Dr. Simonton says, if you put yourself in these situations, or if you're already in these situations, you have the ability to unlock completely original thought. He says that drawing upon such physical or societal diminishment will force an artist to examine the undercurrents of discrimination head on to produce work that has a voice that's both unique yet authentic. Now, allow me to bring all of these ideas that I just provided you into one simple concept that I believe in to obtain originality. Your only goal as an artist is to push yourself beyond your self-imposed limitations to find the truth in your talent. Originality is always the end result of an artist who has committed themselves to a lifetime of deep connections to the world around them. A self-assured artist is like the filter to which all existence pours itself into, and out of that filter comes work that is refined down to the absolute essential in all of us. Using all the methods I previously mentioned, they're in agreement with this goal of pushing on your self-imposed limitations. And the things that I just mentioned should be experienced with a commitment to the depth and breadth that they can provide you. Scraping the surface on these ideas, it's just not going to cut it. You really need to commit to finding out what the truth is in these situations to find any hope of originality. Now, what's not in agreement with this goal is the use of any type of drugs. Now, there's probably some of you that are like, fuck you, I'm going to smoke pot, I'm going to drink, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. It doesn't affect me. And I'm going to call bullshit on that day over day over day. It does affect you. Now, however counterculture you believe drugs may make you feel, or however deeply you may believe that drugs elevate your thoughts or your art, the concrete truth is that drugs like heroin are nothing more than a crutch. It's the ultimate lesson in diminishing returns. It's one that steals your life away minute by minute and leaves you void of any thought other than how to get your next fix. There is no doubt that you will be reduced to nothing more than just another heartbreaking example of, possibly the early death of someone who had so much potential. And any early gains you're making with the use of drugs or any perceived originality that you feel you have because you're taking drugs, it's just going to be overshadowed by your chemical dependency. If you are by chance someone who is currently using and you're listening to me right now, I desperately implore you to look at treatment options. We know from Ginger Baker's example that addiction can be managed to a degree that you can once again live your life and make great art. Now, I'm not fooling anybody. I'm no expert in this, and I could never pretend to understand what you're going through, nor to what extent addiction has taken over your life. But what I do know is that you have value, and the world is a much better place with you in it, and especially with you creating art. We need you alive and healthy. So please, please take that step to get help. You owe it to yourself, and you owe it to everyone who's fighting for you. Find faith that you will overcome in the many examples of people who've been able to get to the other side, like Ginger Baker. Take his relentless need to face a challenge head on and punch it right in the nose as many times as it takes until it stays down for good. Well, that wraps up this episode and wraps up an episode that I didn't want to do, but I hope that you found some value in it. It's a very tough thing to talk about. I don't feel great about doing it, but I do hope that some of the examples that we gave to try to, help you look at other ways in your life that you can achieve originality without depending on an external substance. I hope you found some value in that. But as I said at the beginning of the podcast, this does wrap up the first season of Your Art Sucks. So I want to say that I'm absolutely 100% thankful to each of you who have taken the time to listen to the podcast. Every day I look at the number of downloads and they're climbing, and I'm absolutely blown away by that. So it's kind of a thrill for me. I actually never thought anyone would want to listen to me talk, but here we are. So if you would be so kind, if you enjoyed what I've done this first season, if you could please be so kind as to tell your friends about it, or if you're on social media, just to talk about it. Ratings would really help that, and leaving comments would really help me get more exposure on iTunes and get me into the ears of other artists who may need to hear what I'm saying or may like to hear what I'm saying. So I have some great ideas for next season already brewing, and I'm very excited for you to hear them. So please subscribe so you'll be notified when I release the first episode of season 2, which should be coming in a week or two, probably 2. I need to just take some time and compile some really good ideas into solid programs. So thank you very much for being here, and we'll see you in season 2. So stop listening to me and go practice your cognitive disinhibition.